Pushed up. Thank you, Matt. Good evening, everybody. I'd like to call to order this City Council Committee of the Whole meeting for Monday, September 25th. We have 3 items for discussion tonight. We're going to mix up the order a little bit just because my voice is going, so I need a little bit of a break. We're going to move item B to A and then move on from there. So first we have discussion of multimodal street proposal, and we have Councilmember Goldman. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, thank you. I wasn't even paying attention. Are there any citizens who would like to make public comment at this time? Can't see that far.
We don't have anybody online either.
Okay, thank you very much, Councilmember Furtani. Yeah, so Councilmember Goldman and Councilmember Riddle have worked very hard on this proposal, and we look forward to their presentation. Please.
Sure. All right. Yeah. So if you can get the PowerPoint up, basically it's going to look pretty similar to the PowerPoint that we talked about last month. We've made some changes based on feedback from other council members at the last COW. It's the big button, right? Yeah. Okay. So again, just to remind you, motivation is we're looking to calm traffic, make things more safe for people to walk and bike around on local streets. Inspiration was what Seattle has done with their Healthy Street program, of which there's a couple that come up to around 145th Street. And our idea is that we want to kind of pilot this on 3 streets early on, just so that the public can get used to it. We can kind of learn about how the best way to implement it. Now, in terms of changes from last month, something we heard, especially from Councilmember Bodie, is that we want this to be community supported. So we don't want this to be a top-down, we're going to dictate these are the streets that will be converted. So for the pilot, we have identified 3 streets, which I'll show on the next slide. But we're going, instead of just saying these are going to be pedestrianized streets, we are going to reach out to people who live on those streets, and city staff will solicit feedback about whether they want this. And if the majority of them are in support, then we'll move forward. And if we don't have majority support, then we won't convert that street to a multimodal street, and then we could look for others. So that's one of the big changes that we've made. A second change based on something that Councilmember Lebo had talked about is that we know this works. It works in Seattle, it works in Bothell. And so the focus on implementation will be how can city staff implement this effectively? So less on, collecting data on does it work, more about, how do we set up an efficient process for residents to give feedback about what streets they would like to see converted and what sort of mechanism is there to get public feedback about if they like it or not. And also just adding a bit, and I'll show you some draft language that Councilmember Riddle came up with for a draft ordinance. Also what the role of city council would be in approving future streets as we go. So those are kind of the 3 new things since we talked about this last month. So here's a map, and the 3 streets in green are the ones that would be part of the pilot study. So on the left map, we have Hamlin Road and 44th Avenue. On the right map, we have 37th Avenue. And again, we would reach out to the homeowners. Looking at Google Maps, it looks like there's roughly, I'm going to say 10 to 15 houses along each of those stretches. So reaching out to those homeowners and seeing if we have majority support of those homeowners. So those are the 3 that we had discussed, Councilmember Riddle, Deputy Mayor French, and I, and that we feel that they're good choices because they see cut through traffic. They are roughly parallel to other bigger streets like Ballinger Way or Bothell Way. And so they would benefit from this sort of approach. Here is language from the ordinance, and the ordinance itself is included in the packet, but just emphasizing that it specifies those 3 streets. We kind of debated about what the threshold should be, and I'm happy to hear feedback from others. We kind of converged on a 2/3 supermajority, that we didn't think it needed to be unanimous because that sets a really high bar. But if it is a fairly substantial change, we do want to make sure there's substantial level of public buy-in. So we were thinking 2/3, but I mean, that's the sort of thing we can discuss. And so it would be a 2/3 supermajority to approve these pilot streets, some sort of petition process where if 2/3 of residents on a street are interested, that would trigger the review process for future streets. And then presumably there would also be a mechanism to revoke it if in the future people had a change of mind and didn't want this to be a multimodal street anymore. There'd be a similar process where they could take that out. So that's kind of the key language in the ordinance. The ordinance itself is pretty short. It's one of those ordinances that we would be working very closely with staff. And I'd also be happy to hear Director Perigo, since a lot of this would fall on actually both Chief Harden and Director Perigo, since this would kind of fall on Public Works to implement, the police department to make sure it's running correct, it's running safely, to hear your perspective on, what you think of this as a project. And then also there's a program draft that kind of has a bit more detail about the nuts and bolts. Again, just kind of showing that the process would be that if 2/3 of residents on a street were interested and they petitioned the city the staff would first evaluate whether it meets criteria, whether it is a reasonable street to make multimodal. And then we would have a public hearing about it, and then the council would vote. So that would be the process. Though, of course, if I'm happy to hear feedback about what you think the process should be. And then the criteria that staff would use, I mentioned that, it's susceptible to cut through traffic. Also that these changes would not have a negative impact on emergency services, delivery services. So to clarify, I think Bothell has completely pedestrianized their main street where there's no cars at all. This would not be that. This would be local access. So local access, emergency access, delivery vehicles, mail trucks, that sort of thing. So making sure that these roads would be suitable, that it wouldn't have any impact on those services, that Public Works is able to handle the workload of converting these streets, that it's not too many all at once. And also looking at that it's geographically distributed. So it's not just like this corner of the city is multimodal and the other 80% of the city is left alone. So just making sure that all parts of the city are being touched by this. So that's kind of a summary of where things are at, and I'm happy to answer questions. And I keep saying I mean, this was a team effort, so we're happy to answer questions about it.
Councilmember Riddle.
I'd just like to add on to your great presentation that the program draft was really cribbed from what I found online from the Seattle program. So it kind of took the pieces that seemed relevant to us and put it into a smaller sort of sized program, which seemed more fitting for us. And I think to acknowledge that the 3 pilot programs aren't necessarily distributed through the city yet, we recognize that, but we did want to just start with a small piece of work and validate it, and then we would build up to something that would be more well distributed across the city. So we recognize the current proposed streets don't do that, but we expect that eventually it would be well distributed across the city. So other than that, I'm also open to some questions if anyone has some.
Thank you, colleagues. Thoughts, Mr. Lebo?
Thank you. I'm supportive of this. So my questions are just merely intended to clarify and help you through the process here. Would you, and it would seem to me that if we have a public process for a public meeting and then council approval, even though that we've thought of these as sort of pilot streets, I would still put them through the same process, that they have expressed interest in this through the supermajority, and that we have a public meeting so that others who may wish to comment on whether or not it should be a healthy street can do so. Is there any reason not to put the pilot streets through that same process?
That seems totally reasonable. I mean, I think especially hearing from the neighboring neighborhoods, because while it's the residents that are most directly impacted, the people who live in kind of the greater circle around it would also have an interest. And I think it would be totally reasonable to have a public hearing on these 3 streets, assuming we have community support for them.
Thank you, Mr. Lebo. Mr. Furutani.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor, and thank you, the team, for coming up with this great proposal. Like Councilmember Lebo, I'm fully in support of this. And I'm just wondering, is the 2/3 of the residents, how do we know I mean, do we have like a good census of who lives where? Or is this more of an informal 2/3?
I think it would have to be, we would know, we get on the map, we know where the street is, where the barriers would be, and it would be approaching each of the residents that are living between the barriers. How that approach would occur, I think is kind of an administration question. Letters, however that would work. I think we would just have to make sure that we make that effort to reach out to 100% of the residents. And then if 2/3 are supportive, then we can move forward with I just totally forgot the name, the process, and we can move forward with the hearing. That's what I was trying to say.
And so on point, would it be better to say residences?
Perhaps more technically correct, sir. Yes.
Fair enough. Mr. Lebo.
So just to follow up on this, are these guidelines similar, as you mentioned, to, I believe, Kirkland or others in terms of suggestions for 2/3 or interest in residential, or did the council itself decide? And then the other is that if we have a 2/3 majority for initiation of this, I would suggest that it's a 2/3 majority, if that's the agreed number, for dissolution of it, just so the same.
I guess, so we started out with a majority, then a consensus, and then we just discussed kind of amongst ourselves, because we wanted a number that would represent how we felt our community would feel comfortable. I cannot remember what the Seattle threshold was. I apologize. I don't know that at the moment.
I don't have an answer, though I suspect, not being able to find it online and searching for it, that they probably had a more administrative approach where they would reach out and have a survey, but they probably delegated a lot more authority to SDOT to actually just say, it's going to go here. I suspect. So I think our process is probably a bit more public focused.
Mr. Goldman, on point, I think you're correct. I think it was much more administrative, but I think there was, I think there was also a mechanism for, after the initial pilots, for people to make application for certain funds to move forward with the project, but I'm not certain of that. The 2/3 numbers just seem simple to me, as opposed to some other arbitrary kind of thing from a political standpoint. or a democracy standpoint. There we go. No. Any other thoughts? Mr. Lebo, apology.
I appreciate and understand it, why the streets are distributed out throughout the city as with regard to sort of equity, and also not create sort of areas that have less traffic available to them for through traffic. But that we may find ourselves sort of like denying somebody because they can't demonstrate that in fact it is equally distributed if it's adjacent or near somebody else. So I would just caution to say that we should strive for rather than require.
I think that's sage advice. From my perspective, and weighing in here at the end here, I really support this. I think it's a great way to make some simple steps moving forward with, some calming and very minimal expenditures. There were other roads, as just for the edification of people out there who are watching this later or watching it live. I can't tell if we have any attendees. There were some other roads as well that we considered, but the issues with those roads are multifold. One of which is, of course, as Mr. Goldman indicated, that if there's not an alternative route, that becomes very challenging. Meaning, if there's not a major opportunity for somebody to go around that road, so they really do not have a reason to go on that neighborhood street. The other one is there are a couple of roads where it makes a whole lot of sense for us to do neighborhood streets type of program, or a multimodal streets program, but the one of which is I'm forgetting the street name now, actually has a Metro bus route on it, which is strange because it's a very residential street, but just off of Ballinger up here, which would make a perfect sense for eliminating some cut through traffic. And I think, again, this is at the nascent days of considering these kinds of things. And if the community can embrace what they see as a positive step with some of these pilots, then maybe it'll grow a little bit organically. Other thoughts other than whether we need get a rowboat to go home. And by the way, just the power's out in parts of the community. The chief just indicated that. So that's one of the reasons why Councilmember Castleor is not here. Mr. Furtoni.
Thanks, Deputy Mayor. And one question I have for the team. I mentioned that 37th between 150th and 153rd is marked as a truck route. Does that make it? Did you check in then whether that makes any difference?
I think we'd have to get I don't know, Mr. Perigo, what you know about that? I don't know why that would be labeled as a truck route. It's a neighborhood street with cul-de-sacs.
I'm assuming it's because it's basically one of the few ways to get into that neighborhood with a large truck, but yeah.
I would say possibly if it would be interesting if it's a delivery route versus a through route. And I think that would kind of weigh on us and how we would address it. And I don't know enough about that particular road to be able to say what it might be wanting to be. So we'd look into it.
All right, other thoughts on topic? All right, we're moving along very quickly here. Next on the agenda, thank you both for this. And while they say it's a team effort, it's those folks have carried the lion's share of the water in this particular endeavor. So we all appreciate it very much. I just want to bring back two topics. And again, partially this is because we were supposed to have budget conversation this evening. So these are things that were brought back just because they were going to be coming back later. And we needed some agenda items to move forward. We don't have as a matter of fact, we only have one more cow after this, unless we have a special cow. We do not have cows in November and December. So, and that is discussion of the street racing ordinance. And I had our clerk send out the Shoreline model, which some of you have seen before. I think it's an excellent one. I just wanted to do a touch base with everybody to see whether this is something that you all are amenable to us having our legal team look through and model it after our own characteristics of the community. And so we have this in our portfolio of things that can make a difference. One of the things that is important to recognize is that not only does having a street racing ordinance on the books enable us to consider traffic safety camera installations under the 4 different categories. But additionally, the state has, as effective, I believe it was July 1st, enacted a statute that says if there's recidivism when it comes to racing, that there's the option for the prosecutor to seize a vehicle to make it stick. And I think that that's one of the missing components. Chief, did you have any thoughts about that particular aspect of it? Not to put you on the spot.
What's your question?
About the seizure of vehicles. And that was, when we discussed it before, you'd indicated that was kind of one of the missing components, and they actually came through on that one.
That actually is very effective when you seize, and there's options of, a 30-day seizure, a year seizure, or straight up seizure, and the city takes the vehicles. I think Kent had pretty good results from that, and people seem to not want to be in the street racing scene when their vehicles were taken.
Okay. Thank you, Chief. So with that, colleagues, should we move forward with, again, a head nod of, yes, Councilmember Riddle first.
Just a brief question. I think you mentioned this earlier. I just want to confirm the topic of street racing in this in the Shoreline ordinance talk about racing and exhibition, things like doing donuts and so forth. But I think you had mentioned before that this would also cover folks who are simply speeding against themselves, if you will, and kind of that driving recklessly at that fast. So that would still be covered under this kind of ordinance in these zones.
That is correct. And that is one of the important distinctions between sort of an exhibition situation where they're spectators and which, as we all know, there's been some real tragedies at some of these events, both from accidents with vehicles, but also violence. The legislature has defined the street racing as not only that kind of aspect of it where it's like a competitive nature, but also an individual vehicle exhibiting speed for specific purposes of showmanship, showpersonship, whatever the vernacular is. And I think that that's a really important too, because we do see, we have seen, I mean, all you have to do is go up Ballinger and you can see there are donuts right in the middle of Ballinger, right at the border of our community here. And I think that it's, again, this is not specifically because we have an endemic problem here within our community. It's more that it gives us an option for the police to have, the PD to have multiple methods to enforce the laws, and not only through the racing ordinance, but also it enables us to be able to put in additional cameras, installations, should we choose to do that in race zones, which are deemed race. You know, no race zones, as Shoreline does. Shoreline right now, I believe, has Highway 99, 115th,
15.
I'm 15th, excuse me. Richmond Beach Road is which has had some real serious issues. And then there's a couple other, I believe, I think it's a total of 5, but don't quote me on that. And it's, again, this is one of those things where I wish we didn't have to go to sort of this piecemeal putting things together, but I think it's an option to help, you know, another tool in the toolkit, so to speak. I'll go with Mr. Goldman first.
Right. Yeah, this seems reasonable. And yeah, if it's working for Shoreline, I could see it working for us. My question is, does street racing include roads where people routinely drive in far excess of the speed limit, but there's not really a competitive nature? They're just, oh, it's a 30-mile-an-hour speed limit, but people do 50 routinely.
That's an excellent question. I would assume that it'd be at the discretion of the prosecutor when it came to how something was, you know, prosecuted, to be redundant. I would assume that would be the case. I mean, there are situations I can certainly see that, like on 15th, when somebody's doing you know, in terms of Shoreline situation where somebody's racing through North City at 80 miles an hour. They're not only going to receive reckless driving, but then they potentially would be receiving, you know, a citation based upon, you know, their no racing ordinance as well. I don't know what the threshold would be, and that would really be up to the prosecution to decide. I think, Mr. Goldman, and I don't want to get over my skis about trying to interpret the law, but it's a good question. Yes, Mr. Vertoni.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. And again, I'm broadly for this kind of ordinance. I just have a question. Are we going the full meal deal as Shoreline did with the anti-spectating portion of it?
Again, this is a model. I certainly would probably leave it to our legal team to decide what is the best approach in consultation with the prosecution and the PD. I don't think we've ever had an issue with spectators at an event, Chief. Am I incorrect about that? Yeah. I think that's fairly unique to sort of built out areas that are, you know, like North City, where they've had issues, and of course in Richmond Beach too. But again, I would defer. This is just the model. It's been effective for Shoreline to a large degree, as I understand it. And so, and again, when it comes to the RCWs, this is out of the 4 different categories for the additional speed cameras. This is one of those requirements for that area. Other thoughts, Mr. Lebo?
Thank you. I'd like to ask our Chief Harden, do you support this approach, and do you have any reservations about it, since you'll be the one actually implementing it?
So I don't mind supporting a racing ordinance and how it's written with Shoreline. My officers, we don't have a problem with racing. That's my apprehension with this is, if we had this happen, they're going to be cited for reckless driving. And even after this ordinance, if it gets done, they're still going to be cited for reckless driving. What Shoreline's ordinance looks like it does is as two things. It really does put that spotlight on the spectator, which could basically say, if you do this, you're creating an environment that brings the street racing. So it would stop people from doing it if we were to enforce the people that are spectators within 200 feet, I believe, of the event. Number two is I said from the very beginning, you're going to get hit with a reckless infraction or citation, which is misdemeanor arrest. But they've added a SOAR order. Basically, if you're in this area and you've been in trouble for it, then you can get in trouble again for the violation. That would stop a lot of people from wanting to come into this area. And I don't mind that at all. And to anybody's point that wants to give the police more tools in our toolkit to deal with these kind of things, that's great. But I start off with, this is not a problem in Lake Forest Park, but it is something that we can utilize, and people will think twice about it when we make contact with them and say, hey, you're going to get in trouble, arrested for reckless. You're going to get arrested for being in this particular district or this area, this whatever areas are designated. In the 20 years I've been here, I think I've had 2 racing events, and they've been in the last 5 years, especially during COVID when the streets were a little less used. And they started using it in Shoreline and trying to find different areas. They came here, they met with our officers, and they decided it was not a good idea. And that was on one occasion. The second occasion, it was overwhelming for us because we had 2 officers on and we've got a sergeant blaring out to the group, you need to leave. But if it was in full force, we would have to get more units out there. So I don't know, that was a lot of words there, but I don't mind having the ordinance. I don't see the issue because the officers are still going to do reckless driving with the straight racing RCW anyway, regardless if we have the ordinance or not. And they enforce it that way in Shoreline as well.
Member Furutani.
Thanks, Deputy Mayor, and thank you for your comments, Chief. So in some sense, we should do an ordinance like this in the sense that, as you said, some of the Shoreline folks decided it wasn't a good idea to race there anymore. And where are they going to go? Well, possibly to a municipality that doesn't have such an ordinance. So in some sense, we need to almost do this defensively. Not that I'm saying that's a great justification for having an ordinance, but I think the more uniform we can be across the North County, the better off we all are. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Colleagues, other thoughts on point?
Just to echo Councilmember Furutani's thoughts, if everyone around us starts doing this, we'll become the only place where they think they might be able to get away from it. And just if you're not racing, it doesn't affect anybody. So.
Thank you, Councilmember. Mr. Lebo.
Thank you, Chief Harden, for your comments, and I am generally supportive, like my colleagues.
Thanks, everybody. So next steps will be, we'll just put this, again, this is another tool in the toolkit, trying to make sure that with limited staffing with the PD and increased pressures on our roads, that there's lots of options for proper enforcement, including, whether it's a reckless driving ticket or, under the auspices of the SOAR component of this, it's going to put a stake in the ground saying, hey, don't do it here in our community, as well as it puts another tool in our toolkit from the standpoint of that the 4th component of the traffic safety camera installation, which I'm not sure it will be something we'll be utilizing. But again, I just rather cover all our bases. Okay, any other thoughts on that topic? We're moving forward pretty quickly. And
just a question about your next steps.
Yeah.
What are you having legal kind of look over this, and then are you planning on possibly bringing back an ordinance for us to review? Is that the thought?
yes,
Okay.
Exactly. And I would like to, give our legal team a chance. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. There may be sections of this that are superfluous or not applicable to our, and we can have additional conversations with the chief about what makes sense in terms of the makeup of this. This is pretty inclusive, and I think for us, again, as the chief indicated, we don't have the problem that some of these other communities have. However, let's make sure we have enough things in the books to, if we're going to do it, let's do it. and make it so that it's there's options there for the prosecutor and the PD as well.
Would you consider bringing back the changes to the traffic camera zones? I think we have a park zone, we have a school zone. You would bring back that at the same time if this were coming back to council?
Absolutely. Tangentially, that would be the fourth component. Our legal team had indicated that with the absence of this, it didn't make a lot of sense for us to pass that component of the additional options for the traffic safety cameras. So that would be, make sure I'm not speaking out of turn, option D, I believe it is under that section. I pull up the RCW here in just a second. I apologize, I'm losing my voice. Mr. Goldman.
So actually, looping back to the multimodal streets, same question as Councilmember Riddle. So what would it sounds like there's broad support. What would our next steps be for the multimodal ordinance?
That's a great question. I think probably what we should be doing is we can, as a matter of fact, we can have a conversation tomorrow at our agenda meeting and talk about some of the next steps in terms of division of labor on that. And then we're also, as we go through the budget process here, we're going to have to be making sure that we add an additional modest amount of money to the mix for the, what do they call them, ecology block signs and things like that, and see where we can find some. We don't have a whole lot of wiggle room in the budget. Actually, we have no wiggle room in the budget, so we're going to have to figure out what we want and what we need in that regard. But I think we can certainly get this moving forward in a pretty, reasonable fashion here later in the fall. But I would love to see this formalized here, by the end of the year. So it's in place for people to work with, and not saying that it's going to be implemented all at the same time or anything else. We have very limited resources. So does that make sense to you all? Please.
I think that makes perfect sense. I think an approach of what is our most budget neutral option versus kind of what's our full fledged, and kind of how Seattle started, because they were just kind of creating these off the cuff during the height of the pandemic, and they just used whatever they had, and then they sort of formalized it later. I'm open to a stepped approach as we move this program forward, especially if the pilot program doesn't garner a lot of interest across the rest of the community. I don't want us to invest too much into sort of a whole new thing if this turns out to not be something the greater community is interested in. I don't believe that's going to happen, but I'd like to be sensitive to that and do and approach it in kind of a phased fashion from an infrastructure standpoint. It's just my opinion.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that. And by the way, I still haven't understood what the differences are between some of the north end installations in Seattle and some of the central, I shouldn't say central, but like 70th up by Greenwood, why they have sort of more robust installations in terms of the signage and the ecology blocks and the traffic routing. Some places they just have sort of signboards with double, tape kind of situations. And then like at 74th and Greenwood, or 70th to 74th, I believe it is, just off of that on First. It's a really nice, some planters and some various things there and maybe it was done through a local improvement district type of program or donations. I'm not sure, but we can certainly dig into that and find out, because I think that one is the one, from my standpoint, really reflects the character of our community, where it's aesthetically, it makes sense. You've all seen the pictures. I think somebody took some of those pictures. So that's the kind of thing without breaking the bank, and something that's easily removable if the community chooses that it doesn't work.
Absolutely. And I do believe that Seattle has two categories. There's sort of like a play streets. If you happen to have a street that's adjacent to a park, and it's sort of, they consider it an extension of the park, so that they may treat those differently. And so I think we'd have to just do what works for us, like you said.
Before we leave this topic, if I recall, one of you two was telling me that Shoreline is still interested in talking about Perkins.
Yes.
Would you like to elaborate on that for 30 seconds, Mr. Furtani?
Absolutely. Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Yes. And so I've been actually talking both to council members in Kenmore and in Shoreline, and the idea of having a actual true connector that's protected from cars to some degree between the interurban and the Burke-Gilman Trail has a lot of resonance with them. I didn't think Kenmore would be that interested, but they're interested. So, but the fact is that I was kind of hoping to bring this up at the October 9th dinner that we're having at at Shoreline with both city councils. And the idea would be fairly straightforward, is that from our city limit at Perkins, and I forget which the cross street is up there, but down would be essentially a pedestrian bike lane protected from the uphill still car lane. And the idea would be then that you could go up Perkins in a car, but you couldn't come down in it. Now, the things that need to be worked out, since I haven't talked to the chief or with the fire department or anybody like that, is basically how emergency vehicle access would go and whether or not that would cause a significant issue with it. There are many different models, and I'm not wedded to that particular model, but as a starting point, discussion point, that's what I brought up.
Thank you, Councilmember. And as I mentioned before, I've talked to 6 families just tangentially on this topic who live along that route, that road. And when they've said, oh, where they live, I said, hey, do you have any interest in some sort of change here, making pedestrian or, some sort of change in that environment? And I think that I know a couple of the families have indicated, particularly with young children, because my daughter goes to Brookside, talking to them, they're very concerned about the cut through traffic from coming down from 185th and all the development that's happening up there at that station. And when that station comes online, there's deep concern about the additional burden that's going to be placed on the neighborhoods. So, and this is, again, we've talked about, that idea has been thrown around for decades, literally long before any of us were involved in city kinds of things. But thank you for that. And we can, we'll see what our friends at the other cities have to say when we meet with them. I guess it's a week from next Monday. Yeah, oh, please.
Just this morning, we spent 30 minutes talking about closing that area just for a run and all the problems it could cause and that kind of stuff. So this is a tough subject to figure out how this will all work, because we have a 5K run that we're looking at. Where do we close areas, but how do we have traffic and people still get to their houses, and how we have emergency vehicles? So it's not really an easy subject of trying to figure out where to close. But this morning we did spend 30 minutes for just an hour of closure.
Yeah, thank you, Chief. Yeah, full closures, that's a pretty difficult thing, I can imagine.
Well, that means you're like halfway there.
Okay. Fair enough. We'll leave it there. Okay, the last thing was a question. The last topic we have for discussion was whether we wanted to request of the administration to do an equity analysis. Again, this is tying off some of the requirements under the RCWs when it comes to traffic safety cameras, and an equity analysis is required for the at-large cameras that we are allowed to have, speed cameras. Again, this is sort of, there's no decision or no discussion, no studies or anything that have been done about placement of anything, but it's again to have tools in the toolkit if the community chose to move forward with those things. And we talked about having the administration do this, but we never really formalized it. And I think that this is one where if we're going to do it, we need to make sure. I wanted to bring it to you before the budget, the mid-buy adjustment, because it's going to cost some money to do. This is to ask an outside contractor to do that equity analysis. And I believe that there is a bit of precedent for it now, whereas last year there was not. Thoughts or comments, Councilmember Riddle?
So my thought is, if we're going to move forward with the equity analysis, we should have a pretty good interest in moving forward with the next step. It seems like if we were to do the analysis and not move to the next step for a certain amount of time, that analysis may not be timely enough to be used. So I think I'd like us to have a reasonable assumption that we would want to seriously move forward. The other piece is looking at, this is fairly new. Are there grants out there that are supporting this work, since it's sort of new work from the state legislature? And I'd be much more supportive in this if we felt that there was at least an opportunity for us to reach out to a grant that could help offset some of the cost of the analysis. So those are sort of my two thoughts. If we're going to move forward with this, we should have a strong sense we'll move forward with the next step. And can we get some offsets to the cost? Otherwise, I'm interested in moving forward in general, if those are happening.
Thank you, Councilmember Goldman.
Yeah, I think it's reasonable. I mean, if we want this at-large traffic camera, we have to do the equity study. So it makes sense to start that process off for the same reasons that Councilmember Riddle just said. Reading through the language, it is fairly vague in the state legislation as to what is required. So I would want to make sure that we have some pretty clear guidance as to what has to go into the study. I want to avoid a situation where we pay a contractor a substantial amount, they do a study only for, say, WashDOT or Commerce or whichever agency is in charge to turn around and say, oh no, this isn't good enough. So just make sure that we know exactly what needs to go into this.
Thank you, Councilmember. And on point, well, let me back up for a second. Bellevue and Seattle both have departments of that focus on equality and making sure that things that are not implemented that have a adverse impact to any group. And part of the reason, as my understanding and talking with our members of our legislative delegation, is that they put this provision in there because they wanted to make sure that there wasn't going to be a situation where a community could say, we're going to kind of, this area is going to get speed cameras because we don't want to police there. And I think that is exactly we want to make sure that there's never a question of equality when it comes to enforcement on anything. And I think that there has been a situation, which I won't mention specifically, that where there's been enforcement that they needed to do an equity analysis in advance of what they chose to do in terms of the law. And so I think this is kind of an appropriate reaction by the legislature to say that. And moving forward just for a second, one of our friends who does some of this work for us as a contractor is also a council member in another city, and has indicated that last year there was not precedent and there was not studies that had been done, but now my understanding is there's more sort of ground. We didn't want to be the first, for sure. Seattle, Bellevue have the money. They have the departments actually to do this. Other cities, as Tacoma as well, I believe, has a department that can take care of these things. So on point to both of your questions or comments about making sure that if we do this, we move forward with what we're talking about. I would say it's pretty conditional. If we're going to do this equity analysis, there needs to be a finite period of time that we do the analysis of where the installations would be and move forward if the equity analysis determines that it's equitable, and from there. So, Mr. Furtani.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. And I just have a question about the equity analysis itself. What is it going to tell us? Because we don't, as far as I know, we've not had one done in the city before, right? Regarding traffic. So I'm kind of curious, what kind of information are we trying to get out of it?
That's an excellent question. I would have to leave it up to our transportation experts when it comes to that part of it. On other levels, I think we all have some thoughts about what an equity analysis should be. I believe that there's a certain amount of irony here, in my opinion, that traffic cameras, to a certain degree, if they're applied across the community and not just put in like one area, there's a certain amount of blindness to them. And there's less chance of bias, in my opinion. However, again, I'm a layperson, and I don't want to speak out of turn on that. And I think that there's an opportunity here to make sure that we're being, if the state legislature requires it, I feel like we should jump through that hoop. And a reminder that this particular statute expires in 2 years and it changes. And I think that we might be, if we wait too long, I think we might be looking at a moving target. We've already seen changes in the requirements for red light cameras. Some other things have marched along over the decade, I think, since more than a decade since we put the first one in. Please.
Oh, and don't get me wrong, I'm not just wanting this equity analysis for the sake of getting the camera in place, but I am genuinely interested in what kind of metrics they use. And if we can use that as a baseline for future studies we might be doing, especially with regard to our comprehensive plan, which we're revising. Question is basically, is this an analysis that might be valid for other parts of the city in addition to just that area where we're doing the racing zone or whatever?
Thank you, Councilmember. And my biggest the priority is to make sure we adhere to the state statute first. The second, and to give additional tools and put additional tools in our toolbox. The other thing I think is really important is I want to make sure that we do not, I'm hoping, and again, as a person who doesn't really know what this looks like, because I don't think there's a whole lot of precedent other than what's happened in the last year since the legislation was passed. I want to make sure that we are not doing something inadvertently that's impacting, disproportionately impacting a group, that we're not aware of that impact. And for example, if it comes out that by placing a traffic camera out here, we're adversely impacting people who are driving around because they can't afford the tolls on 520, there it is. I mean, that's exactly the kind of thing we want to make sure we avoid. We know people are driving around, but at the same time, is it a specific question of equality? And again, I have to leave it to the experts to decide whether that makes sense. At the same time, I really believe that with the pressures on our roads and the pressures on our PD, that whatever we can do to give them additional tools and take the burden off them, I would like to do that. Please, Councilmember Riddle.
And I think kind of amusingly to me, the places where I would want to use, especially the at-large speed cameras, are where we're dealing with cut-through traffic, which isn't necessarily our own residents. And I think one of the challenges, of course, is when you place a camera in an environment, you may be impacting those residents, because that's in their neighborhood, and that would disproportionately impact them. But if we're focusing on, as I think we would generally as a council, in the cut-through traffic, then we're actually addressing a larger body of individuals. And it would be, I think, hopefully addressed in this equity analysis, that would be not a challenge, because it is, in fact, not targeting a very specific population by its location. It's targeting a greater population because it's in a cut-through traffic prone street. So, because I think that's why I would be interested in putting these at-large cameras out there, would be to reduce the cut-through traffic more so than to try to slow down our own residents, because I think our own residents do a fairly good job because we live here. But so we'll see if we move forward with the equity analysis, let's see what they say. But that's my thinking, is that would be where I would want to use them, and then that would hopefully not have an equity issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely spot on, Councilmember Riddle. I mean, anecdotally, we see the cut-through traffic being a very large challenge. And I think too, and the chief can probably back this up, that the vast majority of the tickets that we get are from outside our community. And then the people who do receive a ticket within our community, fortunately, knock on wood, I have not received one yet. The vast majority of our residents who get one that are within our community get one and they're done. There's not a lot of recidivism, except for one person I know who an earful from recently, but shame on them for getting a whole handful of them. If you can't slow down in a school zone, that's a problem. So I think that that's really what it's about. And if we had the resources to do a wider analysis of the cut-through traffic, which I think we need to get to at some point, particularly before the two stations come online, we need a baseline to understand what we're dealing with and where we're going. I think we're going to be better equipped as policymakers and as a city to, not do sort of a scattershot approach to try to figure out how do we catch up with some of these challenges. So, I thank the legislature for giving us additional tools. We don't have a hospital. We have park zones. We have school walking routes. We also have potentially, if we had race zones, that's the last one in the mix. And the race zone, maybe it's not even necessary that we don't ever do that. I don't know. But again, I think that I think it's one of those things where provide the opportunity rather than be reactive down the line. So Mr. Lebo.
Thank you for bringing this forward as a discussion item. I'm, like some of my other council members, are always interested in improving traffic safety. Councilmember Riddle asked the question, are we getting ahead of ourselves with regard to doing an equity study before we've actually identified the need? And as I read this RCW, that does seem like a consideration, is that we do need to identify a need before we do an equity study. I think we call them traffic safety cameras. People call them traffic cameras. They're not very popular. And so I would be hesitant to say that we should start with an equity study before we've identified the need. That, I think, sends the wrong message to our community. I think it's important that we identify the need, and that the equity study is a component of making sure that it is an appropriate thing to do.
Fair enough. I think we could certainly reverse the identify the need and then go down that path. And that could be part of an additional we could shift gears. John, I appreciate the thought. I think that's appropriate. I wonder whether the needs that we have in this community are accommodated by the existing legislation that we have. And that's what I throw out to you guys. I don't know whether that's there are lots of different opportunities here for consideration and making things safer near our schools, near our parks, et cetera. And so I don't think we have to, do this soup to nuts by any stretch of the imagination. Mr. Goldman.
Yeah, I agree with Councilmember Lebo that for some of the school walk zone and the park zone, the objective is a bit more obvious, since you're near a school, you're near a park. For the at-large speed cameras, that could go anywhere. So I'd like to see a data-driven approach, and maybe we can get that from the chief. What are the parts of the city where there is the most speeding and there is the most need? And that way we have an objective, like, okay, this is a known area where people are driving recklessly. We want to address that. And then the equity study can tell us, are we going to solve that problem, or at least address that problem without unduly hurting marginalized groups?
Mr. Furtoni, thank you for that, Councilman Golden.
Yeah, that's a great comment, Councilmember Goldman. I was wondering, aren't we in the middle of a NACTO study already that is at least looking at the two state highways?
No, it was to identify local roads. First, that was the first phase, was local roads.
In that case, can that data be used?
That's a good question. Maybe what we should do is put it in terms of, if there's through analysis that there's a need, then we sort of a trigger for the equity study, which is kind of what we talked about last August, September. I'm losing track. And to Councilmember Lebo's point, that maybe that's the approach, is doing it the other way, do the analysis and then say, hey, there is a need. I think we all see that anecdotally there are places that we would not have a camera put in place. So go ahead.
So on point, and no disrespect to the police department, but a lot of the reports that we get, for instance, in the city administrator's report, are anecdotal, and exactly because that's where the people were caught. But the question is, would the larger study then, do that whole percentage thing that we're trying to move away from, how much of this traffic is moving at 20 to 30 miles an hour and so forth? And that would be a much better measure of need. And I was wondering, Councilmember Lebo, is that the sort of thing you were trying to imply? It was basically, if we had that kind of bar graph of essentially what the distribution of speeds on a particular road are, that would be sufficient for demonstrating need for an automated camera?
In looking at the RCW, they suggest places that have, based upon a road safety plan, that suggests that travel speeds are a consideration, higher collisions, or actually they also have subject to specified restrictions and penalties on racing and race attendance. So going back to this, that it will add value because there's a need. Traffic cameras are not popular.
Thank you. I think we have a pretty decent data on collisions, because again, those are reported and logged. I know that we have the mobile speedometer that I think it tracks. The mobile trailer that tracks quantity of people, but does it track any speed variation, or would we have to like do what was done on Bothell Way that Sound Transit did to get the speeds?
The
Or
radar
Washington.
trailer that you're talking about does not gather the data, but the speed readback signs that we have in the city, we have several of them. They hold data for about a month, so we can get the volume and the speed. And then we have data collectors that we use with our traffic calming group, that if we have an area that's an issue, we put the collectors out that gathers volume and speed there. And we've had collected various different spots. And with the traffic study with Transpo Group, they're able to get mobile data to kind of find where the problems are in the city as a big umbrella of speed and volume. That's what those traffic studies do.
Because it seems like if we have that 1 month data from our locations, which we kind of targeted those signs and locations that we felt had a need in the first place, might be able to help us get some internal data without having to rely on an external source and a lot of hours and money to just see what we have in those locations where we're already tracking data. It might be a good first step to validate the need. And if that level doesn't validate it, then I think we have to ask ourselves, what's the next step?
Thank you, Councilmember Riddle. Colleagues, if I may suggest in the well, in the interest of time, we're actually doing really great. I was just thinking about the interest of making sure that we have all the information, additional information. I think there's a lot of questions here on the equity study. And so let me do some digging a little bit further on this one. And maybe the approach that we can take going forward is that the council might consider requesting a money in the budget to do a analysis of speeds on our state routes. So it's a parallel effort, pun intended, relative to this, the local roads, just to see, partially because since we're requesting the WashDOT to lower the speed limits on our state routes, maybe our own independent analysis, which I believe would be honestly, since the state is using the 85th percentile as their basis on a variety of things, which is completely, in my opinion, antiquated. Looking at it through the lens of the NACTO city limits type of guidelines and seeing what it looks like from there. But that's just a forward-thinking kind of thought. So why don't we just table this for now, and but we will move forward with getting legal to look at the street racing ordinance and see what that looks like, and bring it back, as well as the addition of that component of the required under RCW 4663-170 in terms of putting that in our allowed uses of automatic safety cameras. Mr. Lebo.
I'm supportive of that. Just curiously though, because everyone carries one of these cell phones, are companies selling data where they aggregate speed limits that you can get heat maps for your city based upon time and day? And therefore you don't have to go around trying to do the analysis because it's already been generated, because people are providing their data anonymously.
Please, sorry. It's moved to
second.
It's been moved and seconded to excuse Councilmembers Bodie and Cassover from this meeting. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any nays? There you go. The token A. Thank you. You just wanted to do that, John. Thank you very much. And as you know, Councilmember Kessler probably has no power right now. Councilmember Bodie's out of the country. So is there anything else for the good of the order? We can just wrap up here at the top of the hour. If there's nothing else, I want to thank my colleagues very much for all of you for an excellent discussion, but Councilmember Riddle and Councilmember Goldman for the multimodal street proposal and all your work on that. Excellent, excellent work. I really look forward to seeing the first implementation, hopefully late year, first part of the year, something like that. And we're all looking forward to seeing some additional safety measures for people to walk around and be safe. So with that, we're adjourned. Thank you, everybody.